The Ukrainian army has made a very critical move. The Russian soldiers were dealt a very hard blow. The Ukrainian army has launched an operation on Russia's most critical airbase. After this operation, the Russian soldiers were thoroughly cornered. How successful the Ukrainian army has been revealed by the report prepared by the British. Putin was surprised at what to do, and with this report, the whole world stood up. In the last days of the Ukraine-Russia war, the Russian army could no longer make even the slightest move. The main reason for this was that the Ukrainian army successfully used the advantages at its disposal. At the same time, with the support from the United States and Europe, the Ukrainian army had strengthened its strength. Thus, the Russian soldiers were completely cornered. The biggest reason for this situation was the outstanding success shown by the Bayraktars. When the Ukrainian soldiers started to get consecutive victories, the Russian people started to get nervous. But the basis for the Ukrainian army's success was the decadent explosions. The Russian army was in such a bad situation that even the Kremlin was starting to worry now. After these defeats, the Russian people also began to react against the Kremlin. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, wasted no time in moving to blow up the epicenters of the Russian army. The Ukrainian army, deployed in place of the Russian soldiers who fled from this exploding epicenter, has begun preparations to strike a very hard blow to Russia. But the report, prepared about the developments in this region, would change the entire course of the war. Now, Russia has made very critical decisions in the UK, one of the most important countries in the Western Bloc, while the Ukrainian war concerns the whole world. The report prepared by the Western countries, which have studied the war very closely since the war began, had the quality to change all the balances of the war. However, according to a report published by the British Defense Minister, Russia has been looking to improve its air defense system in recent days. The main reason for this is that the Ukrainian army has recently been successful in airstrikes. That is why Russia has started to attach importance to air defense systems. But Russia could not develop itself in this area because the resources at its disposal were insufficient. That is why it is claimed that the Russian army will have very big problems. But if the Ukrainian army continues in this way, the war could progress to the borders of Russia. However, the operation of the Ukrainian army on the Russian airbase would change all the balances. The Ukrainian army has now started to make completely different plans. He began to organize operations to the points where the Russian army has the most bombers. After this move of the Ukrainian army, the Russian soldiers were surprised by what happened. According to the allegations, the Ukrainian army has started to make very serious moves in this region in recent days. The most important of these moves was the Engels airbase, which the Ukrainian army identified thanks to the flag officers. This airbase belonging to the Russian army was strategically very important because it is located in the Saratov region. After that, this region, which is of very critical importance for the Russian army, was blown up by the Ukrainian army. At the same time, there was tension in the Russian army after Ukrainian soldiers destroyed the Russian fleet. That's why the Kremlin had to issue a red alert. There was not even the slightest move from Russian aircraft in response to this successful operation of the Ukrainian army. The Russian army was very worried and panicked. Turning this situation into an advantage, the Ukrainian army was preparing to make tougher moves. But the Russian army wanted to make a move against the Ukrainian army despite these. According to the allegations, the Russian military had destroyed a large number of unmanned aerial vehicles in the region. But these claims were based on Russian news sources. So how reliable it is a matter of debate. Because Putin was spreading propaganda in many areas and trying to hide the facts from the Russian people. Therefore, if the news published in Russia was not contained in another source, it did not make much sense to take these news seriously. After the recent events, with the Ukrainian army organizing operations again, the Russian army began to suffer very big defeats. Although Russian sources deny all of this, there are many sources that confirm this success of the Ukrainian army. However, after these attacks by the Ukrainian army, fires began to break out in the region. And even according to the information obtained, these fires are he even dated in St. Petersburg. According to the allegations, attacks were carried out with unmanned naval vehicles on oil tankers at one of the most critical ports in the region. This operation organized by Ukraine had dealt a huge blow to the Russian army. At the same time, it was revealed how much Russia has failed to ensure border security. But the statements from the Kremlin stunned the whole world. The Ukrainian army had now taken the lead in many areas. The Russian army had been trying to put pressure on the Ukrainian soldiers since the beginning of the war, but Putin's plans completely fell through. Now Putin and the Russian military seem to have accepted that Ukraine is ahead in many areas. However, nothing could be done by the Russian soldiers in response to this situation. Putin had increased his propaganda to hide the seriousness of the situation from the Russian people. However, the Russian army had lost almost all of the advantages it had gained from the victories it had won at the beginning of the war. Ukraine could have advanced the war to the borders of Russia after repelling Russian soldiers on its territory. If the war goes all the way to Russia's borders, it would show that Putin can no longer even protect his own borders. However, Putin would be faced with losing his power. Aware of these dangers, Putin began to make different moves in order not to lose his power. At the same time, Putin was experiencing his worst period since the war began. After the recent events, the comments made by war analysts have resonated all over the world. According to the comments of war analysts, the Russian soldiers were now completely cornered and did not know what to do. After the embargoes on Russia, Russia has collapsed both militarily and economically. Putin, who thought he would invade Ukraine in a very short time, has suffered a very big defeat. Putin was now crossing the line by starting to detain soldiers and many opposition groups that he considered dangerous in the army, because he was afraid that the people or the army would rise up and launch a coup. This situation formed the basis of the uprisings in Russia. Both the Russian people and the Russian soldiers no longer have the strength and patience to endure. Putin's harsh interventions against the uprisings of the Russian people have confused Russia even more. Since the Russian army has lost so many soldiers since the beginning of the war, all the balances of the war have changed. At this rate, Putin would not be able to find soldiers to fight in the Russian army. That's why Putin, who secured the job, signed a deal with the Wagner army. But the bulk of Wagner's army consisted of doomed soldiers. But the resources of Wagner's army were also running low. Putin, who wanted to find a solution to this situation, detained opposition groups and created resources for the Wagner army. According to the allegations, Putin was offering opposition groups to fight in the Russian army for their freedom after detaining them. However, the Russian parliament was preparing to pass laws that would surprise everyone. Putin's plan for this new law was to include women in prison in the Russian army. If things go as Putin planned, about 120,000 women would join the Russian army. But Putin's decision received a huge reaction, and after this decision, it was revealed how bad the Russian army is in a bad situation. Putin couldn't even find soldiers to fight anymore. The vast majority of the soldiers in the Russian army were planning to flee the war. If Putin does not put a stop to this bad trend as soon as possible, it would become a matter of time before he loses the war.